Drilling fluids touch just about everything in the drilling process. We're here to deconstruct the drilling process and drilling fluid concepts to provide a deeper understanding of our industry. In each episode, we'll share information, talk to interesting people, and maybe share a few stories along the way. Welcome to the Flowline, a production of AES Drilling Fluids, brought to you by Matt Offenbacher and Justin Gauthier.
Welcome back to another episode of the Flowline. We have our recurring guest, Josh Young, who's a friend of the show, a personal friend of mine, a friend of the oil and gas industry, and an oil and gas investor. Josh, first of all, welcome, but could you tell us a little bit about what you do to remind anybody who hasn't stayed with us for long?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So, I invest in publicly traded oil and gas companies, and I'm focused on small, mostly upstream companies, but also services, midstream, and so on. And so it was very timely to come and get to learn about what's going on the services side and with some of this tariff mess.
Yes, and a mess it certainly seems to be. So, we were just talking, we're not exactly sure the exact timing. We're trying to get this out relatively coincident with what everybody's talking about, but there were suddenly a bunch of tariffs that were implemented, and then we got a bit of a pause with the exception of China. The markets are sort of going crazy. Oil's going crazy. Besides, I mean, your day job, your educational background is in economics. Like, you've studied the history of people doing these things, right?
Yeah. So just to be clear, so I came at the invitation of your guys' head of logistics, who's sort of famous for having gotten relevant things during COVID supply chain breaks and shortages. You guys even had hand sanitizer like days into COVID magically when others couldn't get them for a year plus. So I wanted to come and ask him some questions. But yeah, I mean, the simple answer is that if you're going to do something from an economic perspective, you do it carefully and clearly, and you phase it in over time with really clear regulations and clear guidelines and all that stuff. And so right now we're sort of in this weird economic shock because of the surprise around the nature of tariffs that were announced. It's not a surprise that there were tariffs announced. And then the very uncertain guidelines and specifications, and then also the concerns around counter tariffs and escalation and various other issues.
Yes, and I think especially, well, we'll get into a little bit on the drilling fluids. It's a drilling fluids podcast about how tariffs can affect different things depending on where they're primarily sourced. But I know one thing that everybody's been watching is the price of steel. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or observations on what you're hearing, because that sort of has been under some tariffs for a little while now, and now I guess considerably more depending on where you're getting it from.
Yeah. So we chatted about this in our meeting with your guys' executive team before this, which was super interesting, and I'm really appreciative to get your perspective on it too. So steel tariffs got implemented, or at least announced, a month or two ago, and so there was enough time for distributors to raise prices and enough time for those price increases to be sort of understood by the industry and ultimately accepted. And from what I've heard and seen, it's increasing well costs by somewhere in the 3 to 6% range, depending on the specifics of the wells. And it looks like for the most part, there hasn't been a drilling slowdown because of that specifically. It's just a cost that it looks like operators are, for the most part, just eating, accepting, and sort of ultimately you would expect it to get passed through with higher commodity prices. And like you referenced, commodity prices have fallen quite a bit since the Liberation Day announcement a week and a half ago from the time that we're recording this. And so, there are some challenges with that. But anyway, steel prices are up, 25, 30%, somewhere in that range, depending on the kind of steel pipe 25% or so is what I've heard. And so, the rig count for the past week was down somewhat. We just saw the Baker Hughes report, but it's hard to say that any of that was really driven by steel as much as just commodity price weakness and economic uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, it is interesting because steel is like this one thing you can sort of focus on, right? Like everybody knows for the most part where it's made. It's a pretty, pipe that meets a certain spec, matches pipe that meets another spec. So from a finished good that is also heavily commoditized, it's a helpful comparison. It's kind of interesting when we try and explain supply chain, going back to pulling rabbits out of the hat during the pandemic, something I'm so proud of our team and their ability to come up with things that were seemingly unavailable and either make them available or find a new chemical solution that that was available. But in the chemical space, I guess just for our listeners, we get chemicals from everywhere. And so trying to explain to a supply chain professional at our customer's office, there may be 60 different sources for products used to drill one well. Because products are blends of things. And it truly is a global supply chain. And so in light of that, a lot of it can depend on its country of origin, how far it has to be transported. So the fuel costs, sometimes a combination of those things. And so, we try and, customers really want to know, like, okay, how much is it going to be? And it's complicated because it depends on how much, how heavy is your mud? Is that a lot of barite? Some of these critical things are recognized as they're on a list and may be exempt or may have a carve out. But I think to your kind of highlighted point of the distresses that we don't know. And I guess typically that just creates angst until we know more. Do you think, do you think this 90-day pause is going to be an off ramp, or is it like 3 months from now, everybody's going to be like waiting for, oh no, it's back?
So a few things. So one, the last part first. I think when people do things that surprise you or inconsistent with what they said previously, it makes you want to recalibrate your assessment of things they say and possible outcomes to a broader potential set of outcomes. So, for example, oil prices had never gone negative on a sort of broad market benchmark prior to COVID. So there was a thought that oil prices couldn't or wouldn't ever go negative. Why would you give away or pay to get rid of something that was worth something? And oil prices went negative. And now anytime oil prices go down by more than a few dollars, you have people talking about oil going negative. And again, very extreme circumstance, but once it happens once, or once there's an indication that it would happen once, there's more room for it to happen again, or for similar things. So on the tariff side, once it went from what was messaged during a campaign, which was fair trade, free trade, not getting ripped off, and really just this message post-campaign of using reciprocal tariffs as a mechanism to get more towards free trade and to reduce trade barriers of our trade partners, to something else, with a weird math formula that was shown and numbers that made no sense, and then the running joke on the internet of tariffing island populated by penguins and not people. And so the joke is that the first free trade agreement is going to be between the U.S.
And the penguins.
The penguins, exactly. The penguin ambassador is on his way over to negotiate a deal. So that's the toughest part. I have this, I don't know 100% if it'll show up on video or whatever, but I have this here. I'll pull this up. So your guys' head of logistics gave this to me, which was really nice. And apparently you made the plastic component that it sits on, and the mineral here is barite. And so I think this is sort of appropriate for this conversation in the sense that, and I'm not, I guess I was compensated with a barbecue before this interview, but I'm not not affiliated or paid for this. But I think it's pretty cool in terms of the innovation of the industry and the mechanisms of solving problems, right? Where, There's tariffs on different inputs for some of this. Some of it's plastic that hopefully was refined here and not and chemical plants in the U.S. and not in China and then re-imported. But there's a lot of complexity around these sorts of things and lots of different places they can come from, and then lots of concerns. So barite's a critical mineral, but it still may be tariffed anyway, and there's not certainty, and it's coming from, in some places, countries that have high tariffs that were announced, and other places places that have lower tariffs, and there might be some in the U.S., but it's expensive, and there's environmental liabilities, and it's a whole sort of really complicated topic. But innovation and focus, I think the industry will solve a lot of this, but it's really unfortunate, I think, just super high level, to have this sort of promise of economic movement towards free trade and deregulation and private enterprise, and to essentially, I think what the stock market and commodities markets have been reacting to is that sort of promise, which would lead to more prosperity for more people, getting sort of rug pulled, and instead this really rapid shift on quote unquote Liberation Day. It's almost like a North Korean or sort of Orwellian opposite of what it means, shift towards government involvement and regulation, and like very opaque regulation where no one even knows what tariffs are on different things, which things are exempt, how they're calculated, how they're actually calculated, not just the formulas that were shared on that one poster board that Trump held up. And so, it's really, I think that's sort of the real question. And that uncertainty is crippling economically. There's even data that convenience store sales were down in the last week, which is amazing because normally it takes a long time for market effects, market prices down leading to a negative wealth effect to affect consumer spending. And then especially for low price discretionary items like gas stations and convenience stores. So it's shocking. It's almost like the COVID shutdowns to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think about, and something that seems like could have been done very differently. I guess that's what's so frustrating. So, I mean, we have all these unknowns, like you said, that creates uncertainty. People sort of hedge, they slow their activity as they sort of lose confidence. Are there other factors that you see kind of out there in the like oil and gas world, geopolitics, other things that sort of raise your eyebrows right now? I know, more sanctions on Venezuela. There's, talks with Iran that may kick off. Do you see those things as, I mean, just kind of the always there variables, or do you think those are particularly new and acute with a new political stance from a new presidential administration?
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. I guess just to start, the uncertainty that we're talking about and that slowdown in activity we were talking about could be very destructive, right? So we could actually have like a lower GDP growth, or actually potentially we could have already been shocked into a recession. Again, that's sort of an aggressive claim, although there's some bank presidents and various other folks out there on TV, even today, that are talking about that. So it's possible. But when you think about it for oil and gas, the problem with shocking oil and gas as an industry and with shocking the economy broadly is that there are second and third order implications of this. And so if you have less activity, which we were talking about and trying to figure out, hey, how much will rig activity be affected, and when will it be affected, and to what degree will it be affected, and will completions be, and so on. The problem with shocking things is that the more you shock them in one direction, the more they can get whipsawed in the other direction. And artificially low rig counts during COVID and artificially high inventories during COVID whipsawed very rapidly to inventory declines and activity increases. And none of it was particularly good. There's not really a winner out of it, right? You end up with high prices, so it was good for the share prices for some of these companies. But, logistics and services and upstream, everyone was sort of caught off guard in both directions from the COVID disruption. I think that may be happening, maybe to a lesser extent right now, in terms of rapidly slowing activity, lots more uncertainty, likely less investment, ironically, particularly in the US, in oil and gas and broadly, which is reasonably likely to lead to undersupply as there's more certainty over time as we accommodate the new environment, whatever that ends up stabilizing at. And stabilizing is a tough word to use right this second, but I'm optimistic that if we could figure out Bidenomics, and if we could figure out, Trump won, and we figure out Obama, we can figure this out. I think we just need more clarity and more time as an industry, and I think as an economy. In terms of what's going on from a geopolitical perspective and other aspects in the news, I think that uncertainty plays into some of the geopolitics too, right? The Venezuela, Chevron had to send ships back that were coming out from Venezuela back to Venezuela today. That was announced, so that's a big deal. That might have been what ticked up oil prices, sort of unclear as our conversation is going. But the risk is the more days in between this conversation and when people hear it, the more uncertain things may happen. And then with Iran, there's potential denuclearization talks, but there's also talks of potentially an attack on Iran, and also a ramp up of sanctions on Iran and additional Iranian affiliates essentially getting sanctioned, including a teapot refiner. I think this was announced yesterday as of the recording, where Teapot Refiner is actually associated with a very large non-Teapot, a very large refiner in China, and some of their, I guess it was their shipping subsidiary or one of their shipping partners getting sanctioned for buying Iranian oil. And so whether there's a direct disruption or indirect disruption on Iran or Venezuela or various other countries, there's a lot of risk and uncertainty in both directions. And then there's also the question of OPEC Plus. I was joking, I went out to Vienna somewhat recently, and that was like the sell signal, because they had a bunch of folks out, and then the next week announced that they were bringing oil back on the market, and then their next announcement was they were accelerating bringing oil on the market at a time where there was this tariff uncertainty. And on one hand, that's obviously very bearish for oil in the short term, but it also increases the odds of an undersupply in the future, and it reduces the sort of buffer. OPEC spare capacity is important in the oil market. Commodity producer spare capacity is very important, because if you look at commodity economics and how commodity prices are set and where producers generate profit, it's not exactly the same as sort of basic Econ 101. And so having the ability to bring more oil on mitigates the right tail risk to price. And so the more oil you bring back on, the more right tail risk there is of oil running out at a time that you need it, and forcing demand destruction through ultra high prices, which we've seen in various commodities over different points in time, including natural gas a couple of years ago, and the winter storm here, where gas got to $300 an MCF or something crazy like that.
Yeah, well, and kind of going back to Iran, I think one thing that you had written about a while ago was during the Biden administration, there were like sanctions in place. There was a lot of this sort of shadow fleet activity. There were a lot of people getting around that. And would you say it appears now that some of that is actually going back to enforcement relative to where it was prior administration? Or I guess that was a narrative I'd heard, and I thought maybe you had issued some comments on that. I was curious if you could expand on that, or share your own opinion if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, no. So I posted this probably dozens of times on social media. There was a lot of nonsense, unfortunately, in both directions around the election. And I felt like, hey, here's something where there is good data and it's measured well. And you could see that sanctions, when they were enforced by the Trump administration in the first term, sent Iranian oil production and exports down dramatically. And the Biden administration at first informally and then more formally waived sanctions on Iran and on countries that were buying Iranian oil, and actually delivered, as I recall, cash to Iran for reasons hard to understand. And so in that time frame, in that 4-year period, Iranian production ramped a lot and Iranian oil exports rose dramatically. And so the question is, how much will Trump administration 2 sanctions impact Iran? And frankly, like, Trump did mislead OPEC. He got OPEC to bring oil production back on in 2018 with the promise of sanctions on Iran, and then chose to delay sanction enforcement by a period of time, which crashed the oil price in late 2018. And so there is a risk that that may have happened, or something similar may have happened, and there might be some sanction waivers, or, and again, we're hearing stuff in the news, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily happening fully. So unfortunately, with the tariff mess, there's a risk that some of the levers the Trump administration had on sanctions might actually be reduced, where this risk of Trump tariffing, the U.S. tariffing a country that went around sanctions becomes less meaningful when you tariff China at what the latest number is, 125, 145%, whatever it is. Once you're over 50% or something, you're just not doing trade. You're at that price.
Right. You're not buying anything. It's an embargo.
Exactly. So once you're embargoed, the problem is you've shot your bullet. So you're done. So now what do you do? Like, how do you implement some of these sanctions? And the companies still don't want to be sanctioned. It's more severe than tariffs, but the big gun's already been shot. And so now I don't know. I think there's a real question around the potential effectiveness, not because sanctions can't be enforced, but it's hard to do all of these things at the same time, and particularly hard to do them at a time where you've introduced a lot of economic and trade uncertainty.
Do you see any hope of a understanding between the U.S. and China anytime soon? I mean, it seems like both sides have ramped this up so much that, like, it would be hard to say. I think there's a lot of pressure once you've done all these things to blink at this point, right? Like, there's fewer mechanisms to save face or to come to terms. Would you agree with that, or do you think that, like, there's hope of figuring this out?
So I've been rewatching The Apprentice. I know it might sound weird. I started doing it even before Liberation Day, but I started accelerating my rewatching of it. And actually, I'd only seen a few episodes prior to Trump 2 coming in office, and I think it's helpful to understand. Obviously, it's supposedly reality TV, but it's like pretty heavily scripted, and I don't think people, for the most part, change for better or for worse. And so I think there's a reasonable shot that Trump is the same sort of vain, shoot from the hip person that he was on that TV show. And while they try to represent him as almost like regal, as like the super senior executive, whatever, a lot of his stuff was really just like, how did he feel that day? And set up principles and then violate them almost right away, and just nonsensical stuff. And I mean, you saw it in the first Trump administration, but I think some of the things that Trump experienced that were really inappropriate or terrible, right? The assassination attempt on him, the attempt to throw him in jail, various other things in between his first administration. Now, I think may have like reverted him even more to how he was earlier in life. And so I think the reason why that matters is, Trump in The Apprentice, you could see very easily going from, she's my enemy and China's our enemy and we're going to beat him, to, oh, hey, we've won, art of the deal. We have, this great deal now with China, which honestly probably wouldn't be that good of a deal, just given sort of seeing how those sort of emotional ad hoc decisions were made by him at that point, as well as, to a lesser extent in the first Trump administration.
It's interesting that you say that. So I was at NAPE, and there was a panel with several folks. So it was a policy discussion. And there were two industry representatives. I can't remember their exact roles, but they both kind of pointed out, they're like, if you read Donald Trump's like views in history going back to the 80s, he's like actually hasn't changed much. And so looking at his past does seem to lead to, where they were like, look, he's always been a tariff guy. He's always been anti-war. Those kinds of things where at least in the context of the way they were discussing it, it made sense. Where it was like, yeah, he's made a lot of these public statements, and he's sort of, if you listen, there's there might be a thread there of that is maybe ironically more consistently inconsistent than I guess a lot of other people. I think of myself 20 years ago, and I mean, when I was in college, it was dumb, but like just how we mature, we have life events, we have other things that sort of alter our viewpoints as we age. And I don't know if that's entirely, I don't know if he had necessarily many of those experiences, is sort of the impression I've got. And I don't know, right? I've never met the guy, and but it just, it sort of lined up for me.
Well, so I shared something on social media today that I think is really relevant for that point exactly. And so if you look at the history of the US in terms of oil and the economic impact of the oil price on the US economy, um, you can see that up until a few years ago, a higher oil price was bad for the US economy. And that was persistently true from roughly the 1960s up until 2016 or so. And around 2016, we became a net oil and NGLs exporter versus importer. And at that point, higher oil prices became net good for the US economy. And I've said this and had lots and lots of pushback and different stuff. We published a white paper on it, and you can literally just see like where that shift happened. And I think the problem is that Trump has this idea from his lived experience, as well as, from most of his business career, where higher oil prices were negative for the US economy. And this has changed, but being able to interpret change requires an openness to considering that. And it appears that that's just not going on. And it's very disappointing in terms of who his energy advisors are and so on. You'd think that they would just grab him and say, look, here's the chart. You like charts. Here's a chart. Shows higher oil good for U.S. economy. Here's why. I know you don't like it because you're a levered real estate developer, but that's not like there's a broader economy than New York real estate and golf courses. Like there's other stuff, and this is the other stuff, and the other stuff needs to work to have people that have money to be able to go play on your golf courses. And so and there's a lot to that calculation. It's not just that we're a net exporter. It's also the capital intensity of U.S. oil production, where we have to run a lot of rigs in order to sustain production, and the vertical integration, where we now process a lot of chemicals and a lot of natural gas liquids, and we do all kinds of other things within that oil and gas value chain that leads to real economic growth from more oil field activity and higher prices. And so, but again, to your point, I think there's just unfortunately not evidence of that sort of progress. And it is quite disappointing, because my thought during the election was that, okay, he might have a wrong view on oil and he might be resistant to change, but at least he's pro economy, pro growth, pro business, pro free market. And so at least there will be sort of that room for economic growth. And, when it comes from oil and gas, among other things, that'll be good and it'll be noticed and appreciated. And instead, there's just out of the gate this sort of flip, command and control, centralized economy, tariff uncertainty, and so on. And so I think that's I don't think this is unique. I think sort of broadly across the industry, people are frustrated, but I think what you just described in terms of his inflexibility and sort of decades of sort of similarity, I think you'd actually see the negative impact of that when you look at something that's changed, which is U.S. oil price. The impact of oil prices on the U.S. economy used to be negative for decades, now is positive in the last few years. And someone in his, what is he, 70 something now?
His late 70s. I mean, yeah.
So people as you get older, you get less likely to change your mind about anything, but especially if your business career was spent in a time where oil was a negative for the economy and you just always viewed it as an input cost, you're unfortunately more likely to sort of mess up from a policy perspective. And again, it might sound like I'm whining. I think in the end, this ends up making me more money, because by suppressing the price of oil, it suppresses the U.S. economy, but it also leads to insufficient exploration, delineation, and to a lesser extent development. insufficient exploration and delineation means that we're going to have much higher oil prices. So in the end, it'll be painful, and then we'll all make more money, and it'll be bad for the U.S. economy, and it'll set back some of the other sort of policy agenda in terms of deregulation and free markets and other things that many people were hoping for as positives.
Interesting. So we fed you some barbecue. I had plenty myself, and we've been talking for quite a bit. So I think it'd be appropriate to ask if you have any sort of closing thoughts or anything else you'd like to share. And also, certainly, how people can follow your thoughts as you scatter them across the social media universe.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. It's fun. I realized I got a tie. The last time I wore a tie was at a friend's wedding, and before that was years before. So always fun. It's got the nice AES blue. I think maybe it's purple. So people can find me on X, Bison Interests, or Josh_Young_1, which sounds funny, but and then bisoninterest.com. And I appreciate you guys having me, and I feel like I always learn a lot by hanging out with you and with your team, and really, really interesting to hear about the tariff impact on the chemicals and drilling fluid side of things, and hopefully this all sort of gets resolved by the time of this publication. Maybe there'll be sort of the next set of things. I guess it's worth mentioning just one more thing quickly, which is one of the things that seems likely after all this economic sort of mess and disruption is that we are likely going to see some economic stimulus and intervention. And again, it's sort of sad because the hope was more free markets, less government getting in the way of stuff. But QE is increasingly likely as bond yields, government bond yields rise. The government can't afford high interest rates. People can't afford high interest rates. We were talking about mortgages and sort of the challenges in the real estate market right now because of that. And then there's a decent chance, they actually started talking about tariff dividend checks in January, I believe. And then that got pivoted to Doge dividends. But I think there's a decent shot that we end up with stimulus payments that are framed as Doge dividends and as tariff dividends and various other things, which again is sort of a silly way to say it and not so great when we owe all this money as a society. But I think these are things that may be coming soonish that may actually be quite supportive from a demand perspective, and then ironically inflationary, and may just put us back on that 2021 type, trajectory, policy environment, and so on.
Well, Josh, I do want to thank you for joining us. I'm lucky to have you as a friend because we get to talk about this and so many other things on a pretty regular basis. But with that being said, it's really interesting. I mean, every time I ask you a question, I love the precision of your answers. Like I'll ask sort of a broad, vague question, and you've got like something very specific, or you'll add a nuance to it. There's like, well, that wasn't exactly what I was going to ask, but it's way better than the question I had. Anyways, thank you, listeners, for joining us. If you want to reach out, you can reach us at the Flowline podcast at asfluids.com, or you can find us on LinkedIn. But until next time, thanks to Josh for joining us. Y'all take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please tune in next week for another exciting episode of the Flowline. And remember, may your returns always be full and your trips always smooth. Views expressed in this program belong to participants and not their employees. The program is for informational purposes only and cannot take the place of seeking professional advice. Copyright AES Drilling Fluids.